Okay, so over the next 40 minutes, we're going to take you through some of the key findings of this new report, which is very attractively priced at £25 as a special discount for today. So that's about as much of the activation messages as you're going to get from us today, because we're going to be talking quite a lot about brand building. Now look, in 40 minutes, we can't really delve into too many of the nooks and crannies in this report. It looks at context in lots of different ways. So this is going to be, in some ways, disappointing to those of you who have very deep interest in particular areas, because we're going to just give you a sense of what it covers. And there will be a series, hopefully a series, of follow-on presentations where we dig more deeply into individual issues. The first of those is next Tuesday. If you want to know more about it, visit ThinkBox's website and they will appraise you of all the details. And that's the way we're going to play this out, because we can't really cover it all today. So this is, as you will know, the latest in a series of publications. And very simply what we're looking at here is how does the context in which the brand operates, that is to say, whether it's big or small, online or offline, which kind of sector it's in, how does that influence the strategy? And in particular, how does it influence how we should balance brand building with activation, which is one of the key things we'll be talking about today. It does make a difference. We've been talking about that in vague terms for many years, and quite rightly, we've had lots of questions about, could you guys stop being so vague about this? So we're going to try and nail this now to the extent that we can, and we'll talk more about that as we go through. As always, we've got 500 digital era case studies that we're looking at. I think you all know the IPA database, but very simply what it enables us to do is to examine how inputs in the sense of strategic or media choices influence outcomes in the sense of business effectiveness. And as I've said, we're going to be looking at that in the sense of context. Now, as always, you will never escape a presentation from Les and I without this chart, so my apologies in advance. This is the lens through which we view effectiveness, and in a sense sets up an enormous amount of what we're going to be talking about. And that is to say, you cannot generalize about effectiveness. Short-term effectiveness happens to be almost exactly the opposite of long-term effectiveness. And unless we understand how these two work and pull us in different directions, then effectiveness is an incredibly complex issue. So here is our chart from the long and the short of it, 2013, in which we identify that there are two ways that marketing works. As always, we have said brand building is the primary driver of long-term growth. If we are looking for year-on-year improvements to our share or our trading position, or indeed our price sensitivity, then we need to be brand building. The steps in the growth ladder tend to be relatively modest because it takes a long time to build a brand. We have to keep reinforcing the associations that we're trying to build. But when we do that, it primes growth very powerfully, simply because these decay very, very rapidly. And as I'm sure you learned from Orlando's presentation this morning, that consistency and building on what we've already done is a fantastic way to keep driving growth. And if we do keep investing behind a consistent set of brand associations, then this is the kind of pattern we see. But in recent years, of course, all the excitement has been around the sales activation model, often data-driven in the current era, where what we are essentially doing is serving behavioral prompts to people. Behavioral prompts could be a deal or an offer, it could be some kind of time of day or seasonal message, or just a piece of information, a reason why ad that will nudge us to go and buy the brand now. Now, these, of course, can generate very powerful short-term effects. They can really make us want to go and buy now, but they decay very, very rapidly. Sometimes they're time-limited, always they're not very memorable, because we don't remember facts and information in the same way that the emotional associations that we use principally when we are brand building, they're not memorable in that same way. So the decay rates are really linked to how memorable these different approaches are. And that's where, of course, brand building scores over sales activation. We always, as always, observe that the problem with all of this is that the cusp point at which brand building starts to take over as the dominant driver of growth is around about 6 months into the life of a campaign, assuming, of course, the campaign even runs for 6 months. And the horrifying truth is that increasingly they don't. So increasingly we're putting campaigns into the marketplace that we will never, ever see significant long-term effects from, because they're just not there long enough to embed the behavioral change that we're trying to make. Now, we have always argued, as you know, that smart businesses don't choose between these two routes. They do both, and they do both in balance. They spend on average, about 60% of their budget on brand building and about 40% of their budget on sales activation. And that's what we're going to be finessing in the presentation today. But I just want to nail one myth, because a lot of people have used that last chart, and yes, I think we may know who you are. I've used that last chart to justify short-termism, to say, look, we're in a kind of short-term world, so we're just going to live in the left-hand side of that chart, and that's what we're going to do. So I want to nail the myth that brands and brand building are no longer important in the digital era, if I can, in two charts, because it is possibly the most corrosive and idiotic piece of thinking that we've heard in recent years. So let's just look. We're going to split our 500 case studies into 4 piles. So Dunce's corner on the left, those that didn't do very much for the brand, nor did they activate sales very strongly. The next column, which in a sense is the new way of thinking, which is what more and more campaigns are doing. We're going to put most of our energy into activation. We're not going to worry about the brand too much. Then my third column is going to be, in a sense, the old-fashioned campaigns. The ones that says we're going to put all our energy into brand building, but all that newfangled activation stuff, digital activation, we're probably not going to do too much of that. And then the fourth column is the one that Les and I are championing, the ones that do both and do both in balance, so they build a brand and they activate the hell out of it, probably somewhere not hugely unadjacent to a 60-40 ratio. So this is how this plays out in terms of effectiveness. This is our standard effectiveness metric, and you can see 2 very clear things from this. Firstly, that you have to do both. You have to do both. It's not good enough just to brand build. It's not good enough just to activate the hell out of whatever you've got. You have to do both if you really want to be as effective as possible. But the second point is that if you look at the third column and compare it to the second, it is brand building that is the primary driver of long-term growth. So if we're not doing it, we are automatically putting ourselves in the slow lane. Unless, of course, we're measuring success in the short term, in which case we're fine. But we're going to die in the long term. Now then, a lot of people then say, yeah, but Les, Peter, you know, we're in this kind of really fast-moving business. You know, we're very agile. We turn on a sixpence. You know, that's the way we are. All of that brand building stuff is a luxury for the fairies. We don't do that. So I just want to nail that one too. And we're going to divide our case studies into 3 piles now. And we're going to look at how each of those kinds of brands, those kinds of businesses, were able to drive short-term effects. So the ones that did nothing for the brand, the ones that did something moderate for the brand, and those that did something powerful for the brand. And this is how it plays out. So there's one terribly obvious conclusion, which I'm almost ashamed even to point out to you, which is that if we don't have a strong brand, if we're not strengthening our brand, we can kiss goodbye to being agile in a marketing sense. And we've known this for decades. You know, we've known for decades that response campaigns are much, much more powerful when they have a strong brand behind them and the brand is there to build them. So anyway, let me cut to the chase before I hand over to Les. The principles of balance are actually turn out to be relatively simple, though it does get more complex in certain situations. This, as you will know, is the shape of the response curve that relates effectiveness to how we split our budget. 100% brand on the right, 0% brand on the left. And the sweet spot actually over the last 20 years or so, at the moment, is about 62% brand. More on that later, but that's an average over a long period of time and an enormous diversity of brands. I want to just make 2 points about this. Firstly, that there are 2 ways we could make a mistake. We could go to the right-hand extreme, put all our money on brand building. The cost of doing that is about a 20% loss of effectiveness, but the brand will remain strong. We can correct that ineffectiveness at a moment's notice by simply upping the activation. On the other hand, if we go this way, which more and more businesses have done, and Les will give you a lovely example of a brand that did precisely that at the end of the presentation, this is the problem. Not only do you get an enormous loss of effectiveness, more than half, but the brand weakens. And as the brand weakens, the effectiveness loss will get bigger, and there is no quick comeback from being this side. No quick comeback. It takes time and money to get back from it. Leslie's agency did a brilliant job for their client, but generally it's very, very difficult. So if there is a mistake to be made, it's going to the left, not going to the right on that chart. But let's look at the principles, and the principles are really very, very simple. When activation is easy, we shouldn't do what most businesses do, which is to pour ever more money into it. We should do exactly the opposite of what most businesses do, and that is to put money into brand building, more money into brand building, because we're trying to achieve a balanced set of effects. And if one gets easier, we put money into the other. So take this as an example where the purchase decision is very high consideration. That makes activation easier. So what do? We put more money into brand building in order to get that balanced set of effects. Opposite of what we think. Where emotions are very powerful in the purchase decision, that makes brand building a whole lot easier because brand's about creating emotional connections. And where that is the case, we can afford to put more money, and we should put more money into activation. It's really no more complex than that. Leslie's now going to take you through a number of scenarios where each of those kinds of factors play out. Over to you, Maestro.
Okay, so brand and activation work in synergy, and they need to be balanced. But that balance is different for different brands in different contexts. And the new book examines the many different factors that influence that balance. I'm just going to give you some examples because I think some of these might seem counterintuitive. I think we can all understand that the balance might be different for different brands. But in many ways, I think it's fair to say that it points in the direction you wouldn't quite expect. Let me give you an example. As Peter has sort of hinted, the nature of the purchase decision affects the balance. For some purchases, activation is easy. For some purchases, brand building is easy. And that affects the balance, but it's not quite what you might expect. So, for example, brands that are heavily researched online, high-interest purchases that people will go and explore and Google and do some research on, maybe the brands that they might go to price comparison sites for. Activation is easy. You tend to get much bigger activation responses for those high online search brands. And because activation is easy, you don't need to do so much of it. You can tilt towards the harder job, which is brand building. So the kind of brands that people are going to actively seek online actually need a higher balance, more like 74-26, tilting towards brand. So activation is easy, tilt towards the hard job, which is brand. Now, I don't think that most marketers would have thought it that way through. I think because activation is easy for those kinds of brands, they would tend to think, oh, well, let's do the easy activation efficient job. You're going to see a whole series of graphs that look very similar, so watch closely. Brands that sell online, also you get a bigger activation response on the left-hand side there. Basically, if the brand is available to buy online, it's much easier to close the deal and make the sale. So the activation job is easy, and therefore you focus on the hard job, which is building the brand. So for online brands, brands that sell online, again, it's more like 74-26. Online brands need more brand building, not less. And again, that's not what most marketers, I think, it's not the lesson they've taken out of this. The way in which people buy matters. And another way in which you can make a distinction about the purchase process is about the difference between what we call series purchases versus subscription purchases. So series purchases, you know, FMCG, for example. Subscription purchases would be something like maybe buying insurance, where you sign up for an annual premium, or a gym membership, or could be something like Dollar Shave Club. Now, when you've got a subscription brand, you get much bigger activation effects, because typically you've got your customers' names and addresses. It's easy to do that activation job, and therefore what you need to focus on is the hard job of building the brand. So for subscription goods, it's more like 74-26. Again, that's not the lesson that marketers have taken out of the subscription model. Innovation. Innovation is tremendously important. There's a chapter in the book on the role of innovation. One of the things that we find very clearly is that product innovation, as long as it's significant, massively increases effectiveness. And one of the things it does is it makes the activation, the short-term activation job, much, much easier. So if you've got a great new product, it is easy to get those short-term sales. So you can dial down the activation spend, and you need to spend more on brand. So it's more like 72-28 for products that have significant levels of innovation. And that needs to be flexed depending on the scale of the innovation involved. So for highly innovative products, brand building is more important. Now you can see a pattern now. We've said that online research, online selling, subscription models, and product innovation all make brand building a more important part of the mix, not less. Here's a different one. New brands, brands that are new to market. This is different from product innovation. This is where the brand is new. It's a brand that people have never heard of before. In that situation, it's easy to move the brand metrics. If your brand awareness is starting at 0, it's easy to go up from there. So for new brands, the brand effects are actually much bigger in the early phase of the brand's career. Therefore, for brand new brands in the launch phase, actually, they don't need to spend proportionately so much on brand building. This is kind of almost counterintuitive again. But what they really need to do is to do the activation job. If you've got a brand new brand, then you need to make sure that it's easy for people to buy. And the brand metrics will ramp up in that early phase much more rapidly. So for new brands, in the early phase of their growth, we're talking about 56-44. But as brands grow and mature, the balance shifts. So as brands get bigger, what we find is that activation gets easier. Well-established, big, mature brands tend to have wider distribution, have a much more established customer base. These brands can do the activation job more efficiently than small or new brands. So actually what they need to do is to tilt towards brand building to maintain their market dominance. So as the brand grows and matures, you begin to tilt away from activation and towards brand building. So for brand leaders, for example, you're talking about 76-24, roughly. I mean, these are rough numbers, but that gives you a rough idea. And then the final dimension I'm going to talk about is pricing. This is different again. Pricing, it's not so much the scale of the effects, but it's the importance of brand building in the flow of profit. What we know from our previous research is that if you want to reduce price sensitivity, and I was very pleased to see John Webb talking about the importance of reducing price sensitivity, because it's a massively important profit lever, which is underutilized. If you can reduce price sensitivity and justify premium prices, that's a really, really good way to make more money. And the only way you can do that is through brand building. In our database, in the IPA Databank, what we find is there is not one single example in all the over 1,000 cases of a brand that's reduced price sensitivity through short-term activation. It can only be done through long-term brand building. And the more that you strengthen the brand and the more brand metrics you move, the bigger the reduction in price sensitivity. So this is a job that only brand building can do. And what that means is if you want to justify premium prices and higher margins, then you need to tilt the balance away from activation and towards higher levels of brand building. So for premium brands, we're talking about, say, 64-36, and as you move up to the higher end, super premium, possibly even more. So these are indications of the kinds of flex of the rules and the flex of the 60-40 mix. It also affects the balance, the share of voice rule that Orlando talked about this morning. So the responsiveness of the brand to share of voice, how fast it will grow for a given level of share of voice, depends on exactly the same contextual factors. And the new book's going to, or gives a list of these kind of modifiers of the rule, rather like Orlando's modifier that he talked about this morning, for different brands in different contexts. But Peter's now going to talk about how that flexes and how that plays out in different sectors.
Okay. Thanks very much. And I should say that because we're such kind people, we've put a kind of ready reckoner in the back of the book, which will explain to you how to combine these factors. You're probably sitting there thinking, yeah, but what if I'm a big brand and it's new and it's... So we answer that question, and I think some very smart person at the IPA is working on a kind of online version of the Ready Reckoner. So we're spoiling you, absolutely spoiling you. So let me just talk a little bit about how this plays out across sectors, which is probably the question we get asked more than ever. And I should say in advance, there is a limit to how far we can drill down. I'm just going to give you a top line here. The book does go into more detail than I'm going to give you now, but we just don't have time to go into all the little nooks and crannies. But I just wanted to open by making the point that, and this is a placeholder really for a broader piece of work that we do in the book, which is to say there is no situation where brand building is not the primary driver of long-term effectiveness. You know, even if you are some kind of, I don't know, Trappist vegan beer somewhere, brand building is still going to be your primary driver of growth. Just want to cut that one short. So here we see, here is by category, by sector. In all these sectors, yes, there are nuances. There are some sectors, and in the other services sector, which is a bit of a hodgepodge of very, very heterogeneous kind of businesses. That does raise all sorts of issues, and we go into those in some detail in the book. I'm not really going to go into them now because it's a bit of a minefield. But essentially, you can see the pattern. Whichever one we're working in, we have to build the brand if we want to drive long-term growth. The same, of course, is true of driving short-term effects. It's true in all these categories. If we want to maximize our short-term agility, for want of a better word, we need to be building the brand. And again, it doesn't matter whether we're financial services or durables. It's the same the world over. Now, it gets quite complicated, and Les has already touched on this. Sometimes other factors come into play. Many other factors come into play. So it is a little simplistic to say, let's just look at the activation effects and the brand building effects that are associated with each sector. But it does go a long way to predict the patterns in terms of 60-40 sweet spots that we observe. So you can see here, if you like, that activation effects are much easier to achieve in some sectors, for many of the reasons Les has already talked about. So in financial services, for instance, and in services in general, non-financial services, activation effects are quite easy to get. A lot of online, a lot of subscription, lots of online research are going on in those. All sorts of factors are bubbling around in this area that just makes it easier to activate. So you kind of know where I'm going already, don't you? But let's just balance it off with some brand effects. There are differences in the ability to build brands in different sectors. Perhaps they're not quite as widespread as that. Retail, it turns out, is particularly difficult, and durables particularly easy. And again, that's probably more connected with the emotional power of many durables brands, particularly obviously the automotive sector. But you know, hell, even a window cleaner could possibly be exciting. So that varies, and it's the balance of those two. We said earlier that what we're trying to do is achieve a balanced set of effects. So where activation is easy, we might want to scale down, and where brand building is easy, we might want to scale down both of that. And sometimes they pull in opposite directions. It gets all a bit complex. So let's just look at how it plays out. Now you can see there are some surprises. The other service, the non-financial services, is a bit of surprise when you look at that. But as I said, it's very heterogeneous. We need to divide it into perishable services and non-perishable services. And when you do that, that becomes apparent why you got that slightly anomalous result. I'm going to say no more about that now. I just want to draw your attention really to financial services. Financial services, it turns out, is the sector where we need to up the brand building game most strongly. And of course, as we'll see in a minute, it's one of the sectors in which precisely the opposite is happening. We're putting more and more money out of brand building financial services than in any other sector. But it is because it can be difficult to build brands and it is so easy to activate. So we need to really lean into the task of brand building in that sector. The others, durables, FMCG, not widely different from the 60-40 rule that we've banged on about for years. Retail, again, not widely different, but again, we need to slightly up the brand. Is there anyone here from the not-for-profit sector? Anyone working in not-for-profit? One? Okay. So I will humbly apologise to you for never having talked about not-for-profit for most of the last 10 years. It's a shame. It's been terrible. So we're going to seek to make amends in this report. There is a chapter on not-for-profit. We can't go into the same amount of detail, but I think it's interesting to ask the question, how would it play out in not-for-profit? And it's astonishingly consistent, and it is what you would expect, because in general in not-for-profit, whether it is governmental campaigns that might be targeting something to do with crime or safety, or whether it are charitable campaigns that are concerned with, I don't know, poverty or starvation, these are highly emotive areas in which kind of brand effects should be relatively easy to achieve. So you know where I'm going, don't you? So it turns out, with astonishing consistency, we find the sweet spot is around about 44, 56, thereabouts. So actually, this is one of those sectors where we are advocating that it is probably right to put a little bit more money into activation and brand building, where the 60-40 rule becomes almost a 40-60 rule. So, as I said, we are not obsessive or wedded to 60-40. You have to get it right for the situation in which you find yourself, and it does vary for reasonably predictable reasons. Now, a lot of what we have said, and Les has talked about the importance of brand building, where we have an online brand or a highly researched brand, or indeed a sector that is becoming increasingly subscription-focused. And indeed, there is a shift generally in the economy away from packaged goods towards services. Now, these are all trends that would tend to make brand building a more important task over time. And of course, this is exactly what we're finding. So when you look at the time trend, I mean, a lot of people will be sitting there thinking, yeah, but surely that 60-40 rule must be going south very rapidly. Surely we should be a 40-60 rule by now. It turns out, of course, precisely the opposite is true. Precisely the opposite is true. It's getting easier and easier to activate for more and more brands over time. And therefore, what we can do is pull more and more money out of activation into branding, and we should do that. We should definitely do that. Now, are we standing up here and saying, well, look, forget the 60-40, it's now the 76-24 rule? No, we're not. Because what we're now directing you to do, or asking you to do, is to focus on the right balance for your particular category. And it probably won't be wildly different for most brands from a 60-40 rule. We put this chart up simply to observe that the trend is towards brand. And don't listen to anyone who tells you otherwise, because it's really, really abundantly clear, and for very, very good reasons when you look at the case, when you look at the database. And there are some fantastic examples of brands absolutely at the cutting edge of market trends, where they are, for instance, online, a lot of online research, where there are subscription brands, and the winners, the IPA case studies, come from the brands that have upped their brand building game, not from the ones that have put more and more money into activation. Believe me. Come back to one example of that in a minute on this chart. So this is where we get a little bit beastly. It's so unlike Les and I to get beastly, isn't it? So this chart just looks at the correlation between the extent to which a sector has become more and more short-term in its outlook, more and more focused on driving short-term effects, with all the commensurate focus on activation, and the correlation between that and the reported loss of effectiveness. And here we're comparing the latest period with the period immediately prior to the global financial crisis, when, as many of you will know, the whole short-termism thing started to explode. It is a pretty strong correlation. I just want to focus on 2 points here. One is to bring to your attention, the bottom right, the financial services sector, who are leading the way to the precipice. They are showing us how to screw it up better than any other sector globally. Now, there are some fantastic exceptions. Direct Line is a brilliant exception. There are other case studies that we celebrate. It is not universal. But the point here is that Direct Line has shown us what the value of investing in a brand, even if you are in an online, aggregator-dominated, you name it kind of business. Get back to investing in the brand if you want to win. These guys have shown us how to do it. Mostly, of course, brands are not doing that. The sector perhaps we should learn more from is retail. Now, yes, they're subjected to the same short-term pressures that all businesses in all sectors are. We can't escape those. We're not saying let's ignore them. We have to acknowledge the reality. But the retail sector has been dealing with this pressure for decades. They know all about how to handle short-term pressures, and most of them know all about how the importance of still maintaining a commitment to the brand, even when you are worried sick about next weekend's sales. So they know how to do it. And indeed, some of the best examples of this in the retail sector are from the discounters, the Lidls and Aldis of this world, both of whom have great case studies of how to drive growth, long-term growth through brand building. So let's applaud more what's going on in retail, I would argue, than what's going on in financial services. But lots of brands are in the shit, basically. A lot of brands have done what the brand that Les is going to talk about now faced some while back. The question is, how do we dig our way out of it, and over what timescale might we hope to achieve that, and what kind of commitment do we have to make? So Les has a fantastic case study, which he's going to hit you with.
Thank you. Yep, on the subject of retail, obviously, John Lewis, actually, that's the reason. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the AA. The AA, obviously, historically, fantastically strong brand over a very long period of time, very well known, very well loved. And then a few years back, something happened. I'm not quite sure how this happened, because we weren't working with them then, but they decided to cut their brand spend. And actually, they cut their brand spend pretty much to zero over a period of several years, I think about 8 years. They decided that what they were going to do was just pure activation, hard-working advertising, hard-working activation, focused on those direct response metrics. Lots of stuff, initially lots of direct mail, and then increasingly email, using this stuff to deliver price promotions, basically, discounts on membership. Now, obviously, if you're discounting heavily to bring in new members, you've got to do something to make the money. So what they were doing was hiking the price up at renewal time to get money out of the people once they brought them in. And this strategy had a fantastic short-term ROI. All the kind of efficiency measures were looking really, really good. Very, very efficient, not effective. Because they realized that something else was happening. All the brand metrics were in free fall. I think when we started working with them, we found that about 6% of the British public had never heard about the AA at all. Now, for those of us who are a bit older, that's really, really shocking. But there was a bunch of people who were driving and had just never even heard of the AA. The whole category was becoming commoditized, and we knew that particularly from the search data, because people were no longer Googling AA or RAC or green flag. They were just Googling things like breakdown or roadside recovery or these generic search terms. That meant that they were usually going to price comparison sites, so the price competition was getting fiercer and fiercer. Meanwhile, their existing customers were getting more and more pissed off by the fact that every time they went to renew, and often they were on auto-renew, the price was just that little bit higher. So they felt they were being ripped off, so churn was increasing. That meant more and more discounts needed to bring new people in, and the whole thing was in a vicious spiral. And somebody at the AA did a projection, and they said, our efficiency is absolutely unparalleled, our ROIs are fantastic, and in 5 years we will be out of business. Efficiency is a terrible, terrible thing. If you focus on efficiency, you will ultimately end up... The most efficient way to run a business is not to have one, ultimately. The most efficient marketing budget is always zero budget. Anything divided by naught is infinity. So they'd read a couple of books by some guys called Binet and Field, which they quite liked. They decided to turn things around and reinvest in share of voice, using the share of voice rule, and to reallocate the budget more along the 60-40 rule. And we helped them to make a brand ad like this. So that was quite different. Oh. Sorry, I normally pay for more plants in the audience than that, actually. I couldn't afford it. That was quite different from what they had been doing. It was much broader reach. Instead of tightly targeted activation going to a small number of people, they did something that reached a much bigger part of the population. They used about 2/3 of the budget went on TV, with online video providing amplification, which is kind of best practice. Less focused on price messages and more rational reasons to buy. There is a message in there, but actually a big part of it is just making people feel good about the brand and feel warm towards the brand again, so that when you do some kind of activation, it works more efficiently. And the results were, I think, quite pleasing. So the brand metrics improved, as you hoped they would. We could see that people were now searching for the AA again, rather than some sort of generic search term. Acquisition and retention both improved despite the fact that they weren't discounting as much. But I think perhaps the most important point here is that we actually turned their market share around, which had been declining for 5 years or more, in a single year. So we often talk about the fact that brand building is important for the long-term growth, and it's a long-term investment. But going right back to the beginning and Peter's point, brand building makes the short-term stuff work better as well because they work in synergy. So it actually does a short-term job as well. So it's actually not that hard. And seeing Paul here, Paul Feldwick in the front of the audience, I mean, we sometimes overcomplicate our job, don't you? Don't we? Don't you? Actually, you know, it's not that hard. You need a singing baby and a song and enough money behind it. And obviously a lot of 60/40 stuff from Les and Peter.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to wrap with some conclusions, and with a bit of luck, there's time for a few questions at the end. So what we've set up is that, in a sense, the principles that guide the balance that we need to find are actually very, very simple. We're very simple, so they couldn't be that complicated. Where brand building, where activation is easy, we need to put more money into brand building. It is counterintuitive to lots of people in marketing, which is why we put it up when it is, in fact, blindingly obvious, I think, when you think about it. And when brand building is easy, we can afford to put more into activation. It's very simple. At the end of the day, we're aiming for balanced sets of effects. We're not looking to put all our money into one thing or another. We're just trying to achieve balance between the two. Generally speaking, for a lot of the reasons that Les touched on, activation is getting easier over time. That has been one of the fantastic contributions of the digital revolution. It's more than anything else made the job of activation easier. It's beginning now, I think, to make the job of brand building easier, but frankly, its main contribution to date to the world of effectiveness has been through activation. And so brand building media are becoming more important, no doubt about it. That's one of the reasons we're seeing particularly established brand building media get more effective over time, which we reported on in Media in Focus. So the 60/40 rule is shifting further to brand and quite a way further towards brand. Certainly not going the other way. So what it means, as I said, is brand building media are becoming more important. We need to invest more in those media that are proven to build brands. And you only have to go back to Media in Focus to know where we come out on that. The trend in investment, of course, because it's a crazy world out there, is away from brand. And we know the reasons why. We know we live in a short-term world, financial pressures on businesses to achieve powerful short-term results. But it is very, very corrosive in marketing. And those businesses that protect marketing from the worst ravages of short-term financial pressures will always do better, whether they are partnerships like John Lewis or some of the German-owned retailers or whatever. If you can be defended from the short-term pressures of a very short-term investment community, it makes a big help, of course. But some sectors, some contexts, clearly it has become more of a problem than others. And I'm afraid I pointed the finger at financial services. If there is one sector that is showing us where things can really go wrong, it is that particular sector. But the flip side of that, of course, is that those brands that adhere to the rules and stick to doing great brand building advertising can clean up and can do extremely, extremely well. And then lastly, we'll end on our familiar bleat. We keep banging on. One day. the world will come in our direction. We urgently need to restore balance. I know it is very sexy to do all the activation piece and all these wonderful new tools we have, but we really urge you to take a look at our recommendations, use our Ready Reckoner widget, think seriously about the context of your brand, and try and get yourself to the sweet spot that we're advocating. I promise you it'll be a sensible start point. You may well want to tweak it over time. We can't cover every particular context or avenue that you might find yourself in, but start with that and see where it gets you. I promise you, because we're seeing more and more businesses around the world who have followed our guidelines and have had enormous success off the back of it. So please give it a whirl. Don't dismiss it out of hand. Thank you very, very much. I think we may have a few questions.
Yes. It's so interesting. It's really, really interesting. Yeah, we've got about 5 minutes for some questions. Oh, I've got a question. Oh, gosh, loads. Okay, let's get a microphone to this lady at the back here if we can. And I'll get you to stand up and get your question. If we can get a microphone down to this gentleman here ready for the next question. Thank you.
Hi, it's Kate. I work for GoDaddy, which is a very big digital brand.
Okay.
I love this. We saw when you did the announcement in Australia, and I pinged it round our US colleagues. So totally buy it. I guess one question I'd have from a real digital sector is, you know your lovely zigzaggy charts of short-term effectiveness. At some point, usage, so short-term drives usage, which drives brand. So that should be going up incrementally. Have you ever sort of figured that piece of the equation out? Because, you know, short-term, there's less risk involved with that sort of strategy than putting it in a digital sector with very short-term goals.
Okay. Do you want to say that?
So, well, first of all, something that we don't always say is all activity does a bit of both. So what we're talking about is two different kinds of effects. The short-term effects are basically what you've got is existing demand and interest in the product is being triggered, and that is a pure short-term effect which doesn't necessarily build. The brand building effect is the degree to which you create new demand. One of the feedback loops whereby brand building works is through repeated usage, you're right. But you don't, the sorts of activity, for example, that, say price promotions. Price promotions are a very good example. So price promotions, the logic is that you do 10% off, and then that brings a whole load of new people into the brand, and that should build up over time. For most brands, that doesn't work. What it does is it just sells to the people you would have sold to anyway at a lower price. So a lot of stuff that actually just appears to produce short-term sort of triggers in demand, you'd think that would build up over time. It doesn't.
If I could just build on this, I mean, the point about this is it's about the sustainability of that growth. And I'm sure you can bring new customers in through relentless chains of activation, but they're easy to nick because you're not building any enduring sense of brand. Unless you have a genuinely differentiated product. In the tech sector, I think we accept that there are sometimes brands that have unique capabilities in a way that perhaps doesn't tend to exist so much in other sectors. But even so, I mean, GoDaddy does do brand advertising. It's very right and smart to do so because it means that those kinds of short-term activations that you do to bring new customers in are more likely to hang on to those customers and are more likely to get an enduring long-term growth. So you do need to do both. But as Les said, obviously, we're not saying that activation activity has no impact on long-term growth. It just has much less impact on long-term growth. And I would say, for everyone who has said and looked at our sawtooth, Charles referred to it, that yes, but surely doesn't that underplay the effect of activation? For everyone who said that, at least 3 people have said that overplays, in our experience, the value of an activation approach. Because in fact, what we find is the more we do that, the more it tails off. The more you have to invest more in activation year upon year in order just to stand still. And that is a big problem with a lot of the businesses I work with. Their activation costs are rising. They're bidding, particularly if they're bidding against competitors for particular search terms. And that can mean that you actually have a declining curve, if that's all you're doing. So you kind of need to do both. A long answer to a very short question.
I have couple of hands up. So should we do quick answers? Should we
We'll
try?
try.
And
We're not
wisdom?
very good at
We
those.
don't do quick answers.
I work in financial services.
Martin,
so
thanks.
Very
Oh,
interesting.
I'm very sorry. I'm stuck now. Hang
You're
on.
not going to like us.
It's just the dichotomy for me where you're saying activation on one hand is easy because people are online researching, but at the same time then paid search is almost like your shop window. And if you're not present there, then potentially you're missing really valuable commercial opportunities.
And we're not saying you should not do it.
But is it the hypothesis that the brand building ultimately circumvents getting into a bidding war?
One of the things that's going on, I think, is paid search is a highly efficient activation mechanism. So that's one of the things, one of the many digital mechanisms, but obviously a very important thing, that's making activation work so much better. But what that then leaves you with is the hard job is all the stuff that happens long before people Google things, you know. All the stuff that happens in the 2 to 3 years before people come to market. That's the brand job.
Yeah.
That's the hard job. It's the final frontier. And so that's the one that's left for you to concentrate on.
So, I mean, we're not saying you can completely eliminate the bidding war phenomenon,
No.
but it is a real problem, and it's your only solution. The Direct Line case study, the EasyJet case studies, and I hope a whole load more that will be coming in the latest clutch of 2018 papers, all show what you can do for activation costs when you are building the brand alongside. And if you find yourself, any businesses in this room, any brands in this room, find yourself in a bidding war and you can see which way it's going, it's just to constantly rise, you have to engage with brand building. It's the only way you'll reduce that. So EasyJet, I think from their case study, decided, for instance, that there was no point in bidding for their own branded term, and they were able to save all sorts of money by just having a more powerful brand that enabled them to do smarter stuff in the world of online of paid search. And it's a pretty impressive story when you read it.
Did I see a hand up here? Quick one from here. If you just pass the microphone back, thank you.
Beyond what you've already stated, what were the most counterintuitive learnings that you've discovered in this process each?
One each.
Oh, God.
Can we look at the book?
So we're only just seeing the book for the very first time. We don't know what's in it, actually. Counterintuitive. I think one thing that we do talk about is that we are surprised by the extent to which brand building is becoming more important. I don't think we thought it was going to be quite as extreme as that, but it's clearly quite a growing factor. I don't think either of us really thought that was going to be quite as much as that.
I thought of one, which is about innovation. So what we found was innovation really boosts effectiveness, and that's not counterintuitive. But actually what we found was minor innovation turns out to be worse than no innovation at all, which I think some marketers would find that counterintuitive. Well, the relentless drive for new news through doing product tweaks and minor variant launches and so forth.
So we do have a real pop at the new news model of advertising, which we think is not very productive and not very helpful. But actually quite a few of the marketers I've presented that to say, yeah, I thought that was the case all along. Innovation's great, but it's got to be significant.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Peter
you.
and Les.
Pleasure.
You can chat to them later, of course. Thank you. Thank you very much.